afternoon, and
Good evening. Welcome to R.W.A. Radicals with Age. I am Pancho.
I am Jesse.
So, today we're going to have an interesting conversation in which I am going to ask you a question, and we'll see where we go from there.
Can't wait.
So, our our name is Radicals with Age, and I'm interested in hearing what you have to say about how and why you are a radical, how you became a radical, etc.
I love it. Well, that is a big question and requires a big answer. I'd like to start by saying that this all started, of course, with you, Dad. I grew up in your home, surrounded by approximately 10,000 books, and there was always this ethic of thinking about things critically, asking questions. I grew up in a very nurturing environment to uh, nurture my mind. And so you, of course, are a radical person. And before I was a radical, I was a rebel. I got in lots of trouble as a kid, didn't get the best grades. And when it was time to go to college, I had no idea what I wanted to study or what I wanted to be when I grew up. But I was determined, since again, I was kind of rebellious and our relationship wasn't as strong as certainly not as strong as it is now. And so I set out to discover where there was an error in your ways, right? You were this radical, somewhat fringe thinker. And my arrogant ass thought there must be something that he's missing. There must be something that's wrong about his political ideology that will leave me either being, farther left, more central, whatever it might be. Unfortunately, for that young 18-year-old rebel, I completed my studies and found out that I was more or less in the exact same position as you. However, what's really fun and what I'm really excited to share this little train of thought that I've been thinking about for quite some time, I came to my position in a very different way than you did.
Could you could
So
you say a little bit about your educational experience and how that contributed to your present mindset? Like
absolutely.
what did you study in college?
Yeah. So I started at a tiny, not small like Reed, 3,000 students, but a tiny 300 student school in southern Vermont called Marlborough College, where you got a liberal arts degree. You could focus on math or science or literature, but the degree was the same. And all you did was read books no matter what class you were in. I didn't take any STEM stuff. I'm sure there was experiments in math you had to do. But every class I took was more or less a writing seminar where you'd read books and you'd write papers. And I started with a kind of psychology focus. Then I studied abroad in the beautiful West African country of Ghana. And I knew that I could not go back to that tiny school. And so I transferred to the University of Oregon with a Graham Hancock history text in my hand. And I went to the history department and said, some of this ancient fringe archaeology is really interesting to me. Does anybody talk about any of this? And they said, absolutely not. So I knew that history was not my department. Then during transfer orientation, I was introduced to ethnic studies. And I didn't really quite understand what it was about, but it sounded like there was a focus on the ethnic groups of the US, particularly Asian Americans, Black Americans, etc. So I decided to take Ethnic Studies 101 as well as a history class, and I think a psychology class as well. But I absolutely fell in love with ethnic studies. And the next 3 years that I was at the University of Oregon, I read particularly, I finished with an African studies minor, a Native American studies minor, and then just the ethnic studies major, which had me reading books, particularly about written by, Black people with a critical lens, and same with Native Americans. And so, I read Bell Hooks, Audre Lorde, Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, all sorts of very, very interesting and prominent Black writers, some with a historical lens, some more contemporary. And that was where my journey got started.
You do know that Bell Hooks was my classmate in college.
I forgot that piece. So no, it's one of the funny things about being your son is that either you went to school with these people, or I think it's Derek Bell came to dinner at our house when I was a child. There's all of these names that I read. I remember talking to you about them in college. You're like, oh yeah, I know her, or yeah, Derek Bell. You were screaming as a kid when Derek Bell was over for dinner, whatever it might be. So
Bell Hooks came to our house for breakfast.
nice. There you go.
Well,
Anyway, to get,
before
oh,
before you
please,
get to
please.
that, I want to, having been reminded of bell hooks,
Mm,
I want to go back to an earlier episode when we were talking about the election and Kamala Harris, and I just want to make one little short point that we have talked about imperialism, we have talked about white supremacy, we have talked about the evils of capitalism. And I just want to make sure that on our radar is to also talk about patriarchy.
mm,
And that was one of the big things that Bell Hooks insisted as always part of the conversation. So in
absolutely.
talking about Kamala Harris, we didn't really talk about part of the opposition to her is not only based on race, but is based on the fact that she is a woman. And isn't it interesting that countries all over the world, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, have all had female leaders, and the United States has failed utterly in that.
But maybe in a couple of weeks that will be different.
Let us hope so.
Right.
Okay.
I'm going to dive in back to the central question of why I'm a radical. I'm going to be speaking about this sort of train of thought that I have come to that is sort of this written and oral tradition that I just feel like I've tapped into. And so before I begin, I have to reference and shout out two authors, two books that have largely shaped what I'm going to speak about. Two books that are not in your home and that you have not read. So I'm excited for this chance to represent this train of thought as well as introduce you to two huge role models of mine. So the first one is the 2017 The New Human Rights Movement by author and filmmaker Peter Joseph. He has made the Zeitgeist film series, the number 4 of which has not been released to the public yet, but I was fortunate enough to be in Los Angeles when he did a screening of it, so I got to see it. He talks about Allende quite a bit. It's a very good film that can't wait till it comes out. And he, in one of his lectures, and both of these authors have not only books, but tons and tons of content that you can find on YouTube. So if anyone's interested, Peter Joseph is great. And he got me turned on to Dr. Robert Sapolsky and his book. This is his newest book, Determined, a science of life without free will. What's that shit ass school you got your undergrad from?
Some shit ass school that Bell Hooks went to also, and Rachel Maddow went to also, and Tiger Woods went to also, and Katie Ledecky went to some insignificant place.
Well, he teaches at that insignificant place, Stanford University, of course. And yeah, just wanted to shout them both out before I got going, because again, much of what I've said has either been is in one of those two books or has been a synthesis of the two that I have come up with on my own. But a lot of it is from these two guys. So I am not taking credit for this. This is again part of my education that led me to this position. So let's begin, shall we?
Let us.
So we are going to have to start 2 million years ago. Back 2 million years ago, human beings as we see today did not exist. However, the common ancestor that links us and chimpanzees and bonobos, the two great apes that share, I believe it's 98% of their genomes with us, unlike gorillas and orangutans, who are also apes, but not as closely related. So all three of us share this common ancestor. It's called hominini, I believe. I'm not a biologist, so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And that species split, I don't even think it's species, I think it's genera, split into Homo and Pan, which is where we get Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, humans, and Pan, which is the the apes, the chimpanzees and bonobos. Now, it's very interesting how chimpanzees and bonobos came to be. Again, once they were these great apes, and about 2 million years ago, the Congo River in Central Africa was being formed, and like two twins being separated at birth, two groups of these apes became separated on the two sides of this river. Now, it's very interesting the differences that took place between these two groups of, again, previously identical species. On the one side of the river, we had a very harsh, dry, hot climate where food was hard to come by. And for this reason, the animals that became chimpanzees had to adapt to their environment. They selected for lots of cognitive ability because they needed to be able to problem solve in order to find food. In order to hold a larger brain size, they also needed to grow physically a bit bigger. It's not massive, but a few inches on average bigger than bonobos. A couple of other interesting things about chimpanzees. They are patriarchal. So there's an alpha male that is in charge of the troops. They, again, because they live in these very scarce landscapes where there's not a lot of food and water, they learned to make weapons and they go to war with other groups of chimpanzees to, again, fight over the resources. Sexually, there's a lot of rigid rules. The alpha has access to the best female, and then it goes all the way down to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in order to get a mate, you have to fight your way up to the top. On the other side of the river, you see almost the exact opposite. The landscape in which bonobos came about was a lush tropical rainforest where food sources were abundant. Their brains did not need to grow because problem solving for resources wasn't necessary. There was food more or less everywhere. They don't eat a lot of meat because there's not much of a need for it because there's such diversity in the food sources. Socially, again, very, very different. They are matriarchal societies where a female is at the head of the troops, but there's no sexual-based caste system either. And essentially, to say it plainly, bonobos more or less hang out all day and have sex with each other. They have not learned to make weapons. They do not go to war with each other. They live these more or less utopian lives. Now, to move forward from this sort of biological framework, we have to look at human beings and how we adapt to our environments. Now, an example that Sapolsky gives is that before you're born, you are already adapting and changing to your environment. If you are born in Norway, for example, you are on average likely to live 11 more years than if you were born in Mississippi. Now, again, this has nothing to do with anything inside your control. This is just the womb you landed in and the hospital where you were born. Now, one of the reasons it takes so much, or that these things happen, that the lifespan is shorter, is because in a place like Mississippi, mothers are subjected to much higher levels of glucocorticoids, also known as, to put it simply, stress hormones. We have glucocorticoid receptors all over our bodies. And so stress hormones are very, very important. And the more that you are exposed to these stress hormones, the higher likelihood you have of almost everything under the sun negative. You're more likely as an adult to develop depression and anxiety. You're less likely to finish school. You're much more likely to go to prison. All of these really, really intense social outcomes can be predicted just from the stress level of your mother before you were even born.
And in Mississippi, if you're black, those things are magnified.
Exactly. Yeah. The rates of mother, mortality. Yeah. All of these things. Absolutely. Yeah. No racial component here, but yes.
And speaking to economics, Mississippi also happens to be the poorest state in the United States.
Right. What's crazy about this, again, glucocorticoids and the stress hormones in our bodies, is that these can have, so this is your environment, right? Your mother being stressed, and actually even your grandmother being stressed, you can see these changes. Just from an environmental stimuli, your genes can change. We call this an epigenetic change, where your environment has changed your genes. Now, a super quick lesson on genes. Again, I'm not a biologist, but I've been trying to study this the best I can. Now, when I was learning about genes, I learned about dominant and recessive genes, that if both of your parents are blue-eyed, then you are likely to have blue eyes. But if you have a parent with blue eyes and a parent with brown eyes, the brown-eyed gene is much more dominant. So it's much more likely you will have brown eyes. Now that's, I think, correct for that. But what happens in most gene situations is that epigenetic changes are not changing you from brown eyes to blue eyes, but what it's doing is messing with the proteins that turn on and off these genes. And so, for example, in this example, which is not an accurate one, both of your parents have, or you have a parent with brown eyes, a parent with blue eyes, but because of an epigenetic change, the dominant brown eye gene gets switched off. And so you end up with blue eyes in this example. So it's really fascinating, I think, to understand that your environment, where you were born, the stress levels in your ancestors can affect massive things, not just your eye color, but for the sake of this conversation, the development of your brain. And when we're talking about the brain, one of the most important pieces of the brain to talk about is your prefrontal cortex. It is the most recent part of the brain. It's taken the longest to evolve, and ours, the one in human beings, is much, much bigger than any other animal on the planet. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that tells you to do the harder thing, even though, because it's the right thing to do. Maybe you really want to have a second cookie after dinner, but sugar's bad for you. You've already had one cookie, and even though it's right there, if you have a good developed prefrontal cortex, your brain is going to say, no, 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 don't do that. Dad, have you heard the kind of saying out there in the world that it takes humans about 25 to 30 years for our brains to fully develop?
I have heard that. Yes, indeed.
So it's true, but actually, it's only the prefrontal cortex that takes that long to develop. Most of our brain is done at about 14, 15 years old, which is why I need to bring up the nucleus accumbens, which is the part of our brain that is all focused on dopamine, on pleasure, on instant gratification. That part of the brain finishes developing when you're about 14. And of course, you're going through puberty, so your hormones are going crazy. But the part of your brain that says, ooh, it's probably not a good idea to cheat on the test, or ooh, it's probably not a good idea to have a couple of drinks and get in your car and drive. All of these decisions, all of these juvenile decisions happen in juveniles so much because the part of their brain that would tell them no hasn't developed all the way. And why it hasn't developed is because it takes a lot of social cues in order to learn this. To come back to the cookie example, I can eat 2 cookies. I could probably eat 20 cookies if I wanted to, right? If I can sit here and I can do that, it will only be much later that my body will, my stomach will hurt from eating all those cookies. But my teeth, my saliva, I can do all of that stuff. But it's my brain that has to teach me, oh, when you eat that many cookies, it makes your stomach hurt. That is something that is somewhat physiological, but also social. What's another good one? We learn in this society that doing this to somebody is okay, but doing this to somebody is disrespectful. That's a completely arbitrary thing. We could have developed maybe there's a country where doing this is a sign of hello and doing this is a fuck you. So these are social things that our brain has to learn just from experiencing other people, which is why it takes so long to develop.
Interestingly, this reminds me of Aristotle.
Ooh.
Because Aristotle talks about essentially there's 4 different kinds of people. Everybody knows what the right thing to do is. There are people who know what the right thing is, do the right thing, and feel good about having done the right thing. There are people who know what the right thing is, don't really want to do the right thing, but do it anyway and feel good. There are people who know what the right thing is, don't want to do it, and don't do it and feel guilty. And then there's people who know what the right thing is, don't want to do it, don't do it, and don't feel guilty. Interesting juxtaposition.
Absolutely. The thing that Aristotle obviously made lots of advancements in our society or civilization.
He also said some people are natural slaves.
Right, exactly. And what Aristotle didn't know is he probably didn't know very much about the prefrontal cortex and all of the things that can go wrong. So we've already talked about glucocorticoids. Stress hormones really, really mess with the genes around the development of the prefrontal cortex. And think about it. If this thing doesn't stop developing until you're almost 30 years old, there are so many moments throughout your life where you can have stressful experiences and therefore impact the development of this part of your brain. And so we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, I believe, where I started making a point that Republicans talk about how Black Americans are more violent, which you brought up that the murder rate, that is not, or in school shooters specifically as well, that is not true. However, petty violent crime, theft, robbery, assault, Black people are disproportionately represented in that population. And not just because of over policing, but because Black people are much, much more likely to grow up in poverty, to have generational poverty, and therefore higher levels of glucocorticoids in their bodies, which have led
And that's
to
why they
the
eat dogs and cats.
um, that's Haitians, but yeah, I mean, I guess they're Black too. But anyway, but it leads to the degradation of the prefrontal cortex. One of the things I hear all the time is like, oh, kids in the hood don't have ambition to go to college and get educated. And again, ambition, doing the right things, making sure you're doing your homework every week, making sure you fill out your FAFSA, making sure you study for the SAT, making sure you don't go to parties all the time. All of these little small decisions all have to do with your PFC, and it can be radically damaged from before you were even born, just because your mother or your grandmother grew up in poverty and was stressed out, etc. I think I have talked this biological piece into the ground for now. It's just a brief overview. Again, check out this book and Sapolsky's work if you want to learn more about this. It's fantastic. And for somebody who is talking about such complicated things such as this, he's a very clever and witty and interesting person to listen to. I hope I get to meet him one day.
And of course, the question we're dealing with is how is what you have been saying about biology, how has that contributed to your radicalness?
Yes, we are getting there. I promise. So, the biggest stressor in our world today, I would argue, is money. You need money to pay for housing, food, clothing, water, everything. If you don't have money, you can't live. And you're going to be, for lack of better words, stressed the fuck out. And that is going to be what's leading to the development of these glucocorticoids and therefore the damage to your prefrontal cortex, etc. What I think about when we think about financial stress and this impact on our culture, again, is chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees lived with financial stress their whole development. They didn't have access to food consistently. They had to fight for it. To use something we've said in the show, chimpanzees have to be about me instead of we, because there's not enough to go around. And human civilization is much, much, much more similar to chimpanzees than bonobos. To take us back, not nearly as far as 2 million years ago, but we're going to go back about 50,000 years ago to what we call the Neolithic Revolution. Prior to that, human beings were hunter-gatherers, and there are actually still hunter-gatherers on this planet today. And if you go and speak to those people, they have no concept of inequality. They have no concept of patriarchy, stuff like that. They live, in collectivist communities where everybody works together to make sure everybody is fed and taken care of. They don't have murder. They don't have rape. They don't have these horrible social problems we have today. And so I think one of the big reasons for that, though agriculture has of course been huge for our civilization, but it has also changed how human beings live. Once we were able to produce enough food, or we didn't have to constantly be nomadic traveling around, now we have the ability to set up shop somewhere local and to stay there, to stockpile resources, to have private property, and therefore having something you need to protect. When you are a nomad, all you take with you is what you can carry. You're not storing food for the winter. You're walking to the next place. So there's no property to protect. But this change made it so people had property and people who didn't had an incentive to rob and steal from those other people. And this, I believe, is the scarcity ethic that has survived all the way from 50,000 years ago, all the way to today, that we still have this system where there's not enough food to go around or there's not enough money to go around. So the people at the top are trying to hoard as much of it as they can. However, things have changed. In about 1870, just a few years before you were born, uh,
Oh, really?
but in 1870s, when we had the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, we went to having massive production power. Even just a few decades before that, you had some of the founders of capitalism. One I like to talk about is Thomas Malthus, who's famous for the Malthusian trap, which is he did this mathematic calculation and he looked at the rising population and he looked at the current capacity of the technology at the time to produce food. And he saw that as population kept climbing, there was going to be a point, the Malthusian trap, where we couldn't feed and clothe everybody. And so he has some horrific quotes talking about how poor people are just a way of life and you should more or less, you know, step over them on the street and spit on them because some people are just destined to be poor. Fucked up shit, if you ask me. However, he didn't know any better. He saw that there wasn't enough to go around. And so, again, me versus we, he did what he could to protect his own and didn't think twice about poor people. However, since around 1870, things have changed dramatically. We have the technology that if we wanted to, we could feed, clothe, and give shelter to every single person on this planet. It's only that we continue to live in a capitalist system where there is no incentive to take care of people that we don't do this. However, if anyone has looked at any of these numbers, I think it's a couple $1 billion to like end world hunger. You know, Elon could just do that tomorrow if he wanted to. Now, of course, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but there is enough money in circulation to take care of everybody on the planet, and yet we don't do it. And instead, we do almost the exact opposite, which brings me to my next point, which is the most heinous example of how horrible capitalism has gotten. And this is the phenomenon of structural violence. I assume most people in this room or in the audience have heard of structural or institutional racism, which was coined by who?
You tell the people.
Kwame Ture, aka I had to look up the full name, Stokely Standiford Churchill Carmichael.
Indeed.
He coined the term structural racism, which was a huge evolution in, sociology that it's one thing if you have, racist white people saying, we don't want black people to buy this land, so we're going to make a law where black people can't buy land. Institutional racism is colorblind laws that have a racist effect. Easy example was grandfathering back in the day. The law was if your grandfather was allowed to vote, then that means you could vote. Again, there's nothing anti-black or anti-white in there until you think about it. Well, wait a second. Back during Reconstruction and Jim Crow when this was happening, every black person's grandfather was a slave. And so, of course,
Exactly.
they weren't allowed to vote. So that is an example of institutional racism.
You
Now we're going
are
to move on.
you are aware of the fact, since you brought up Kwame Ture, that he is the person who really initiated the term Black Power
Yeah. Yeah. Very,
in
very cool dude.
in Lowndes County, Alabama, in the 1960s. Are you also aware of the fact that the voting rights group in Lowndes County, Alabama, they had as their logo a Black Panther?
I did not know that. That's awesome.
And the Black Panther Party adopted that logo from them.
Mm, very cool. I did not know that. I have a feeling we will be doing episodes related to the Panthers, and this certainly won't be the last time we'll talk about Mr. Kwame Ture.
No, no, it will not be.
But I digress. So, structural racism, structural violence is again violence inflicted on people that isn't intentional. I'll give you an example. Let's say you have a car company we used General Motors as an example in a previous episode. So let's say you are making cars and the paint that you use to paint the cars has lead in it. And so when you rinse your brush, the lead-based paint goes into the water and it goes downstream to a little community of people who use that water as a drinking source. So all of a sudden, or maybe not all of a sudden, after a few years, people in this community start complaining that they're getting very sick. And so you have somebody come out and they test the water and they say, "Ooh, yeah, this water has tons of lead in it. It's horrible." And so the community starts saying, "Hey, General Motors, you need to stop using this paint. It's poisoning our water supply." But General Motors is making tons of money. Everybody loves their paint jobs. So they think, we could invest money in a new paint, but then we won't be competitive anymore and we'll stop making money. So how about instead we use the state to help us out of this predicament? And so they decide to, rather than pay to get a new paint or to move their factory, they instead decide to hire a lobbyist who goes, before the EPA and says, "Oh, this paint is okay and it's safe to use." And, you know, the people in this small community, they're not getting sick from the lead. They're getting sick because they're poor or undereducated or whatever. But it doesn't stop there because this community doesn't give up. So they keep complaining and they end up getting a journalist to get interested. And the journalist comes out and says, "Man, General Motors is horrible." And the journalist writes up this huge expose that's going to completely destroy General Motors. They're going to be so screwed. And so General Motors again says, we could again stop using this paint or move our factory. But instead they say, "I know the editor of the newspaper that journalist is at, and I'm going to make a hefty donation to that editor to get the story killed." And so the editor goes to the journalist and says, "That's a really interesting story, but I just don't think our listeners are going to like it. How about you write an article about daffodils instead? If you write a great article about daffodils, there is a corner office with your name on it." And so this is an example of structural violence, that those people in that community start dying from this lead-based paint, but because it was easier, cheaper, it was more market efficient for this company to, rather than fix the problem, solve it in a different way. This horrible problem, everybody knows that clean drinking water is important, but it's a negative externality because of the laws, because of how the system currently works. General Motors didn't have to stop. They didn't have to fix it. And this
Which
happens
speaks to Flint, Michigan.
exactly. It's not a one-to-one, but I certainly had Flint in mind when I was speaking about this. Structural violence is estimated to kill 18 million people every year, twice as many as cancer globally. Because this isn't just paint in a water supply, this is pollution. This is cutting corners to make cheaper goods that break, or microplastics. All of these things we know and have talked about that harm people. Most of them are negative externalities that the system doesn't care about, and it just simply goes on killing people. One more example I want to give, because we are both using Macs and Apple products, and it's been coming up in the news a little bit, but still not tons, is the mining for cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. That you have children, let me say it again, you have children on their hands and knees with no tools, digging pits into the ground to get these metals that's used to make cell phones and computers and a lot more stuff than that too. We use cobalt for batteries, airbags in your cars, all of these things. And I think you've said it in every episode we've done so far. Unfortunately, the blood of these people in the Congo is on all of our hands. We participate in this system. We buy these products. Of course, we don't want to, but at the same time, I'm sure if you ask anybody who works at Apple, they don't want children in the DRC dying, but this resource is super important. And because that country is destabilized and there's not a good government advocating for the people, there is a market incentive to pay as little as possible to get these precious metals, which goes in the tune of thousands of children dying and doing horrible work for virtually no money. That is the mess that is structural violence. And I think that's a good place to say this is what has made me a radical, is understanding that from Sapolsky, that free will more or less doesn't exist. And why am I saying more or less? Free will doesn't exist. We have no scientific backing for it. There is no way that you can separate your unique biology that has evolved over millions of years, and you can't separate your environment that you had no control over, where you were born, the things that stressed out you or your grandmother that led to either the flourishing of your brain or the destruction of it due to high, high levels of stress. And as we've said, this system, because of its scarcity ethic, makes tons of people incredibly, incredibly stressed and therefore not able to make the harder decision when you know it's the right decision to make.
It's interesting also that earlier you had mentioned Norway. You know, you live longer if you happen to be born in Norway. When they do surveys to find out who are the happiest people in the world, Norway is always at the very top.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we've mentioned that before as well. Yeah, there's very little inequality in Norway and Scandinavia in general. That's a really other big piece is thing Peter Joseph talks about called relative poverty. It's one thing to not have, to have absolute poverty, to not have enough food or water or shelter, but it's just as bad to not just as bad, but it can be just as damaging to our psyches to feel poor, to feel like you're not cool enough. You don't have the nice new thing. You don't have the shiny new shoes. You don't have the nice house or the nice car, but everybody on the block does. And that leads to some stress, some potentially like social exclusion, all of that. However, the theme of this show is love and optimism and system level change. So I can't spend 40 minutes talking about how fucked up this system is without talking about how different things could be. Remember, chimpanzees and bonobos were once distinct species, and now we have one that is much like humans, warring and fighting and oppressing women and alpha males and toxic masculinity, all of that shit. But then you have bonobos who have all they need, and so they spend their time socializing, relaxing, and living a good life, which is what I think all human culture should aspire to. Now, when I tell people we need to change the system, the first question is always, well, that's going to be too hard. How are you going to do that? How is this going to change? Is everybody going to have to wait in line for a long time to see a doctor? All this stuff. No, there are some transitions that are actually already happening, but because the system doesn't want them to happen, we're not making them happen as quickly. So there are five that I'm going to run through somewhat quick. But again, this is the work of Peter Joseph and the New Human Rights Movement. So I very much recommend anybody to check out his work. He also has a great podcast, so he goes into much, much more detail about this. Number one, automation. Technology is our greatest asset. It's not that technology is inherently evil. It's that, again, this system incentivizes people to make technology that benefits individuals and not the group. But, one easy example, fast food places have been slowly phasing out human labor and replacing it with automated labor. Nobody wants to work at a drive-through. Yeah, maybe every so often you have a day that's kind of interesting, but I know people who've worked at McDonald's. It's not a fun job. It doesn't engage your brain. You smell like fucking French fries all day. Even if you like those fries, which I do not, which I know is a very unpopular opinion. But you don't want to smell like those fucking French fries all day.
And
But
they don't
because
pay you enough to live.
exactly, but even if they did, that's not a job anybody wants to be doing. And a system that was focused on the collective would say, well, we know that these aren't worthwhile jobs. We're going to automate these jobs completely and remove human labor from it entirely. And so that we need to do in every sector as quickly as possible. We, of course, need to decouple, labor for income, right? We already have spoken before that we need to guarantee people, aka for free, food, water, shelter, purpose, love, community, all of those things. But if we harness the power of technology, we could absolutely do that. Doesn't mean that you don't work at all, but it means you work a much shorter workday. I've seen things that like back in the 50s, they were talking about like 4-day work weeks or, less than 40 hours a week jobs. Like this isn't a new idea. This is like decades old of people being like, why are we spending so much time in our jobs making money to buy shit we don't need or care about? But I digress. That's automation. Number two, access versus private property. A really good example that Peter Joseph gives that I love is about cars. Did you know, Dad, that your car is parked and not being used 90% of its lifetime? Why do we need our own personal car? Yeah, it's convenient, but most of the time it's just sitting in our garage. And if we had a system like Uber, which we already do right now, but if we had a system where, and ideally, again, remove human labor out of it, self-driving cars, and anytime you need to go somewhere, get on the app and a car picks you up and you go where you need to go. They've run some mathematical projections on this. There are currently 250 million cars in circulation. If you run the math, which they have, I don't have the source written down for this, but I could find it for anyone who's interested. They said that we can decrease the number of cars by 80% from 250 million to 44 million. So yeah, maybe it's convenient to have your own car and like I think the longest I've waited for an Uber in the last 5 years is 10 minutes. So yeah, maybe I had to wait a little bit, but let's think about it. 80% less cars on the road. Bye, traffic. See you later. 4 out of 5 cars are not on the road. I think that's worth the 10-minute wait if I can just cruise like it's 2 in the morning wherever I'm going to get where I
Not,
need to go.
not to mention the fact that it would decrease air pollution.
Exactly. Yeah. There are so many positive benefits to some of these changes. To continue, open source. Why do we have Apple and Android that are more or less the exact same fucking phones, but I go over to my friend's house and they don't have a phone charger. I have to bring my phone charger to a friend's house because they have the other one. Why? Why is there 12 different TV brands that all have a slightly different cord? Why is it that, again, like 50 different brands for refrigerators and blenders, but they all work slightly differently? So if you know, decide to get a new blender, but the old one had pieces that worked. Nope, you got to throw the whole thing out and get a whole new blender. It is so wasteful. But again, because of capitalism, there is a vested interest for proprietary knowledge, for Apple saying, well, we have the best charger. It charges our phones, 1% faster than Samsung, and we're holding on to that so we can make more money.
And
No,
that affected our being able to have this conversation because the earplugs that I have now, I had earplugs for my phone, but it didn't fit into my computer. So I had to get an extra pair.
exactly. Yeah, there's all those little things. It used to be, I just saw like a meme on Instagram the other day that was like, the iPhone 10 or something, or maybe even before that, used to come with, a charger. They don't even, and headphones, they don't even give you that anymore. You just get the phone. And somebody joked like, oh, the iPhone 20, you're just going to get an empty box and then have to buy the phone separately. So yeah, this proprietary knowledge is so limiting. If everything is open sourced, and again, this has happened, I think it's Linux did this. And so anybody who dabbles, like, yeah, maybe I'm not an engineer, but maybe I've done a little bit of this and maybe a couple hours a week, I want to go on to this computer program and provide my skills to help make the next charger or the next car part or whatever it might be, right? The collective is always going to be so much better than the individuals. Rather than having these 30 different car brands, if we harness the power of human intelligence and said, okay, these are the things we want to make sure our car has. It's fast, It doesn't pollute. The parts are, as interchangeable as possible. We could have a much better car than all the kinds of cars that we have out there today. And again, you would remove that profit incentive where companies are like, well, if we have a part that could last 10 years, but we're going to use a cheaper part that wears out in 5 years, so people have to replace it. Well, now you have a worse car, right? We don't want to have all this extra waste and garbage. We want to be making parts that are the highest quality and last as long as they can, so we don't have to replace them and throw shit away. Number four, localization. Not to start sounding like Alex Jones and talking about the globalists, but there is certainly a point to be made that anything that can be local should be. If we can grow bananas in California, why am I getting bananas from Peru? That doesn't make any sense. That's wasting all of that fuel and time and energy to get them there. And I looked this up. The average American food plate travels 1,500 miles before you eat it. 1,500 miles. And so they call it food miles. Again, I live in California, I live in Oregon. There's, you can grow anything you want. Why does it need to go? I don't know how far 1,500 miles is. Pretty far. I don't know. Probably getting close to like Texas. Why do I need to get my potatoes from Texas, my bananas from Texas, my, meat from Texas? We can do all of that here. It's just a waste. So again, we should be localizing everything that we can. Yeah, of course, maybe, there's a really exotic, delicious kind of banana that only grows in Japan. So yeah, so maybe those are things that get imported every so often. But again, we should be doing that as little as possible to cut waste, cut, costs and provide people with the best products we can. Now, the last item on this list is the coolest, but sort of the most confusing. And this is what Peter Joseph calls networked digital feedback. Now, this actually kind of goes back to last week's episode where I was talking about Project Cybersyn and Salvador Allende, where, and again, this was in the 70s, so this was a very rudimentary version. You have an economy that is able to respond in real time to maximize feedback and have like a fully integrated system. This is an example that I thought of. Let's say you want to make a bookshelf and you need, of course, lumber, wood to make said bookshelf. Now, how the current system works, you could go to, the Oregon Lumber Company, the Washington Lumber Company, the Idaho Lumber Company, and buy your lumber. However, we're not again thinking about how to best maximize our resources. If the trees in Washington and Idaho have been getting clear cut because there's such a high demand, but meanwhile there's tons of trees in Oregon, then we should be using the wood from Oregon. But instead, right now, there is no communication, there's no feedback system that helps us determine what we should use and why we should do it. And this gets into the laws of nature. We should be always and the laws of nature and the laws of sustainability. We should always be using, as much as we can, resources that can replenish themselves and using them either at or below the rate it takes them to replenish. And then if you're using non-renewable resources, you should be using those only in instances where you can't use a renewable one. But again, right now, you have all three of these lumber companies, as this example, cutting as much as they can and selling as much as they can to make money, not instead trying to figure out, we have an order this year. There's going to be 1 million bookshelves made. And so we're going to figure out, let's just keep it easy. It takes one tree to make one bookshelf. Obviously, not quite. It's going to take 1 million trees to get these 1 million bookshelves. But if we take 1 million trees from Oregon, that's going to be potentially a stress on the environment. That's going to hurt the animals and the habitat and all of that. So no, we're going to take 250,000 from Oregon, 500,000 from somewhere else, and whatever, 250,000 from somewhere else, right? There is no system like that at all right now. This is what Salvador Allende tried to get in place back in the 70s of trying to have a feedback system that told the people, at the top in the kind of command center, ooh, we are running out of bananas in this area. We need to start using this banana source over here, or we need to plant more banana plants really quickly. Or everybody, I know you love bananas, but we need to stop eating them so much for a couple of months. The bananas are like really struggling. So we need to eat, apples for the next couple of months, or else we're not going to have bananas at all anymore, right? These are decisions that aren't life altering. We already sort of do it right now. We know when certain fruits are in season. Most people who don't like GMO stuff, they know, yeah, once the summer's over, I'm not going to find really delicious peaches anymore. I need to wait till next summer when they are in season again. That is a long but brief sort of explanation of this train of thought that I've tapped into that has led me to believe that one, we are doing this shit all wrong, that human civilization has so much more potential to take care of each other. I like to think about butterflies when I think about this. We don't really know how metamorphosis works. We know that caterpillars don't have wings, and then they crawl into a cocoon, and then a few days later, their tissue breaks down and they grow these wings and become more or less an entirely new animal. When I get into a really good mind state, I really love to think about what sort of potentials are there for human culture. We're the most advanced life form on this planet. Who knows what could happen to us in 5, 10, 20, 30,000 years, right? Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, have been around for 300,000 years. That's what we think right now, that we found skulls in Africa, I think southern Africa right now, 300,000 years ago. Aristotle and ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, that shit's like 4,000 years. It's like all we know about human beings. So, not good enough at math for this. Whatever, not quite. 100 times longer. Humans just like us, with the same brains as us, have been living like we have. And this recent period in our history, we have turned into very, very dark days. However, I know that with a couple of small tweaks, that very, that may take some time, that may not take effect right away. You're going to have those, huge, fat, indulgent billionaires being like, no, I want to keep my 50 million cars and my giant mansion that takes up the size of an entire country. But I know that we can do it. And that's why I'm a radical.
And I would say that I like the way that you ended because in order to be, and we've talked about this before, in order to be the kind of radicals that we are, we have to be optimistic. We have to believe that even though a just society has not happened, that it is possible. And that's why we do what we do, and we spend our life working to try to make the world a better place for everybody.
Exactly.
So we have come to that time when we are at the end. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Hope you learned a thing or two, and at some point along the way, managed to smile. So, our quote for the day happens to be from your boy, Peter Joseph. And here it is. The public is increasingly coming to terms with the structural flaws of our economic system. Occupy Wall Street, no matter how crude or unfocused its critics may declare it, has been a preliminary step in what I think will eventually be the greatest social transition of human culture since the Neolithic Revolution. The eons long battle to overcome injustice, group dominance, and oppression has expanded in awareness to realize a deeper context. Activist concerns that have been historically detached from the environment to war to social rights are slowly being recognized as sharing a common root. That root is an economic mode with a distorted incentive structure and a mechanistic framework that conflicts with the basic laws of human and ecological nature. That is our quote for the day. Our song for the day is In the Needle's Eye by the late, great Gil Scott-Heron. So once again, thanks for tuning in to Radicals with Age, and we will see you after a while.